My name is Maniza Naqvi, and this is the third episode of the Little Book Company's podcast. And I am delighted to welcome Siddhartha Deb today with us. And hi, Sid.
Hello, Maniza.
It's good to have you here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me.
And I want to talk today about your novels and your work of nonfiction. Your first novel was The Point of Return. Your second novel is an outline of the Republic. Your work of nonfiction is The Beautiful and the Damned. And your fourth and most recent work, which is a novel, is The Light at the End of the World.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. Happy to talk about any and all of these.
Wonderful. As you know, we're just going to have a conversation here, and this is our third attempt at doing this podcast just in the last 5 minutes because I got a lot of things wrong, which I hope not to do as we go forward. So I am so struck by The Point of Return, which is your first work, and it's a novel. It is so soft and endearing and full of warmth. And it's very different from your latest novel, The Light at the End of the World. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, how much time separates these two books? I think The Point of Return came out in 2003, and The Light at the End of the World came out in 2023, 20 years. I have changed in those 20 years dramatically. India, which is what almost most of my published work so far has been about India, whether in fictional or non-fictional form. India has changed also beyond recognition in the 20 years. And the world has changed also in so many ways, dramatically, drastically in the last 20 years. So I think in that sense, it's inevitable that there would be these massive differences of the person writing it, the world that one is writing about. The Point of Return is my first novel, and it is set in the northeastern hills of India, where I grew up.
In Shillong?
In Shillong. I grew up in Shillong, in the state of Meghalaya, although I am a year older than the state of Meghalaya. I was born in 1970. Shillong was then the capital of Assam. Meghalaya came into being only in 1971. And The Point of Return is, of course, about these internal sort of divisions, these internal divides. But it's also a novel that's about the partition, because the main character in the novel, Dr. Dam, the father's son, sort of dynamic of the novel, Dr. Dam is a Bengali Hindu refugee from Sylhet, East Pakistan, to Bangladesh, to the northeastern hills, where he is also an outsider, this time not because of his religion, but because of his language, which makes him, Bengali speaking, a Bangladeshi. And these are obviously things that I have drawn on from my own life to some degree. But I think it was just an effort to understand to ask the questions: what is home? What is home if you are living in a country that you've not necessarily been born to? What is home if you are going to die in another country, than say the one you live in? What is home if, there are these notions of insiders and outsiders based on language, religion, caste, ethnicity, class, money? What does it mean to have a sense of belonging? And so that's what the first novel is really asking.
Yeah.
And the most recent novel just complicates that much more, takes that further down.
And completely blows it up, I would say.
Yeah. It explodes the idea of home. The new novel, it's 4 interconnected novellas. But the framing novella is about, the main character is someone called Bibi, And she's a middle-aged woman in Delhi in a slightly near future, in a slightly alternative Delhi to the one that we have today. But in India, many people see it as a straight-on, full-on account of what is today, exists today. But it's meant to be slightly speculative. And Bibi is somebody who is also from Shillong, actually, and whose family origins also lie across the border. But she's a former journalist. And when we begin the novel, she has stopped doing journalism for a long time. She has a kind of a really terrible job at a kind of a strange, weird consultancy firm, seemingly making a lot of money in Delhi, but it's not entirely clear where the money comes from. And and it's in India where waves of demonetization kept happening, waves of this just violent authoritarian nationalism. And Bibi lives with a roommate who is also from the Northeast in a little slum in village JNU called Munirka. And for them both, there is the question of what is home? Where do you belong? Where do you live? How do you make sense of the world that you are in?
Yeah, well, that comes through that, they're living in a sort of a dystopian city.
Yes.
And slowly a reality is dawning on her that she's not willing to obviously see at the beginning, but then things begin to clear up for her very quickly. But I just want to go back to your first novel, in which I felt like you were already seeing things quite clearly, and you were seeding the entire novel with the kind of distortions that come from this so-called idea of development. Right? And then in the last novel, it seems to me like you've taken it to its logical conclusion.
Yeah, because there is no development anymore. We don't even talk about it, whether in India, in the 70s, in India, but almost in all formerly colonized countries, the third world, there was this talk of a development, and it occupied a very strange middle zone between actually trying to benefit large masses of people and trying to modernize. But now, now that has been abandoned. I don't think, there might be the occasional rhetoric, but I don't think there's any illusion anymore in the world that whatever quote unquote changes take place, whether they be in technology or finance, for the masses of people, it is not going to lead to a better life. I think that illusion has been abandoned. So development was an illusion, but maybe a kind of a necessary illusion. It was about formerly colonized, devastated societies. I don't use the word nations deliberately but society, social structure, just utterly devastated.
Yeah.
And trying to recover from that damage, either through socialism or communism or some kind of third worldism, or by embracing capitalism and the West, but trying to get themselves out of this sort of incredible damage that colonialism had done, and trying to become complete. But yeah, we don't talk about that. But yeah, there is a lot of irony. There's a lot of comedy about development. Dr. Dam is a veterinarian. He's very, very interested in the idea of, that all the people in the Northeast should be able to have access to milk, and should be healthy, like people are in the West. This is not an unusual for any third world, from Africa to Asia to Latin America.
But at that level, in your first novel, where you have extension workers and you have bureaucrats sitting out in the far-flung areas of a country far away from the capital, they were still idealistic back in the early 50s and 60s. They had a different idea about what they were doing from the entire capitalist project, right? They were trying to improve the lives of their fellow citizens. They were engaged in nation building and state building, were they not?
Yes and no. So the novelist, even the first novel, is quite critical of the idea of nation building because, yeah, there is a degree of idealism, perhaps there is a degree idea of development, but there is also it's also a colonial model. I mean, I think one of the things that the British have left, but now the Indians are the new British. But the Indians who are flying in from Delhi are trying to bring the tribals of the Northeast up to the standards of nationhood. There may be good intentions, but it is still a colonial paternalistic model. And it's one that has been abandoned now completely. But it had its limitations, it had its problems. And so the novel, even the first novel, is very critical of the idea of India. And I know that it's one of the reasons I think I have a slightly difficult reputation in India, because I've always been critical of the idea of India. I've always quarreled with the idea of India in fiction and non-fiction. And I've done it well before the Modi years began. I see, even in the first novel, which is set in the 1970s, I see these distinctions. Dr. Ram is very damaged by the world that he finds himself in. And it's not the Northeast. Ultimately, the bureaucracy, the state is not a very kind thing, no matter its intentions might be good. So I've always quarreled with the idea of India, and you can see it right from the beginning of the first book.
But which state is kind?
Well, I mean, we can have, I think, gradations. I think I see, the more powerful states are, the more unkind they are. The bigger they are, the more unkind they are. So there are gradations. But I was looking at India, and I'm critical of the idea of India, but I'm also critical of the idea of the nation. And I remain that, living in New York, now that I live in New York.
Yes.
And the first novel was written in New York. I had to get away from India in order to write it. But I'm very critical of the idea of the United States, which a lot of liberal Americans, they just say, if it's only Trump that makes it bad, otherwise everything is good. I don't buy that at all. I am very, very critical. I mean, and the United States is a state and an empire. India is a state and a mini empire. And that leads to a lot of its, unkindness and violence.
Yeah. And the United States actually does recognize in its name that there are many states coming together.
Yeah, but
whereas in India or in that part of the world or in the rest of the world, there's a tendency not to look at other places within that nation as being in any way separated out.
I see what you mean. Yeah. But I would say that India, Pakistan, Bangladesh come out of very specific damaged histories of colonialism.
No doubt.
There is a distinction to be made between that and the United States, which is a white European settler, violent settler colony built on genocide and slavery. So, and the United States is like, it's a complicated conglomeration. Benedict Anderson has this lovely line. I think that, a nation is not just that remembers together, but that also forgets together. So all nations have sort of unexamined pages, unexamined parts of their history. I have been interested in following that with India. And I think in The Point of Return, which is set in the Northeastern Hills, it was really influenced by two things. One was the looking at India from the periphery rather than from the center, rather than from Calcutta or Delhi or Bombay, but to look at it from really far away in the hills. And the other strand is, I was also the character, Dr. Dam's son, Babu, is really telling the story. He has left the Northeast. He's also looking back at this home that isn't a home with longing. And so there's a kind of displacement, there's a kind of yearning. And that I think we know because of the histories of partition. That I think maybe the United States, which really prides itself on being an immigrant culture, it also privileges a certain kind of forget. But
Privileges a
a certain
certain
kind of
kind.
forget. You know, you are supposed to abandon the place you came from and just remake yourself, assimilate yourself. But that is hard for human beings. Human beings can't necessarily just shut down everything, that they've left behind. What you've left behind is still remains with you, in you. And, that's one of the things that, the first novel tries to grapple with. And in some sense, I've tried to grapple with in every single subsequent book.
So, you talked about the fact that that there's been such a intense and profound change that has taken place in India in the last 23 years. Wouldn't you, and that kind of change has actually taken place worldwide. What do you think is the organizing principle for that change? Is there something common across the globe that that causes that change? I'm sorry for the noise in the background, Sid, but as you can see that we have 3 workers
Yes.
working out their labor, probably from somewhere in Central America, and they're in that freezing cold outside.
Yep.
And doing a hard day's labor. So we'll live with that. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, what has changed is obviously, and I have talked about this. I mean, essentially what has happened in the last 20, 30 years, it is the end of the Cold War, the defeat of any idea of the left after the end of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the part that always gets unexamined is that along with the end of the Second World, the Soviet Union, the Eastern, is also the end of the Third World. And that is what we are grappling with in Pakistan. So, and not just in India, Pakistan, we're grappling with it everywhere, in South Asia, in Latin America, in Africa. And we are the majority. We are the people of the world. And yet we are reviled. We are considered to be belonging to failing societies. If they are not failing societies, they are admired only because of, like, India is an authoritarian society under a Hindu right-wing, very violent Hindu right-wing party. So essentially, it's the disappearance of the third world and a kind of real scrambling to find a certain way of egalitarianism, justice for people of different kinds. And I think the other thing that has become is also very, very important is that, along with the disappearance of the third world, a kind of rampant capitalism, what we call neoliberalism, and finally the vagaries of climate collapse, the vagaries of climate change, they have just become, which would have been in the works, which would have been visible in their effects, even if the third world hasn't disappeared, even if the Soviet Union was gone. We would still have to ask this question: can we have this kind of industrialization model for the whole world? Can we all have cars? But with or without, climate collapse has become a kind of everyday aspect of our life.
Because this rampant consumerism and this constant messaging of discontent that you have to continue to purchase and purchase, whether you
and the dependence on fossil fuels, essentially what is called the quote-unquote industrial revolution, which was partly in the conjunction with colonialism. We are seeing the end game of that, the kind of dependence on fossil fuels, the rampant power of corporations, which aren't very different from the East India companies of the 18th, 19th century. That's also part of the kind of, and I think which leads to this kind of anxiety, this kind of majoritarianism, this kind of desire to hate people who are minorities, people who are different, this kind of xenophobia, genocidal xenophobia
across the globe.
And that is very much exacerbated by these conditions of climate collapse and incredible inequality that we see in the world.
So there's an anxiety that's being translated into fascism.
Yeah, and the anxiety is there in everybody. It's there in the rich, it's there in the poor, it's there in the in between, it's there, with us, it's there in the West, it's there in the global South. I think Eric Hobsbawm, I think his history of the 20th century was called the age of anxiety, but I feel like ours should be called the age of anxiety.
Yes, exactly. Age of fear and terror and anxiety. And you're talking about the collapse of the third world or the disappearance of the third world as a community. I mean, it is sad that that South Africa brought the case to the International Court of Justice, and that it was not a country such as India.
Yes.
That had always stood with the Palestinians or
yes.
Pakistan.
Although it is. Yeah, I think it's an excellent point. I mean, I think it is wonderful that South Africa brought the case to the International Court of Justice. That is a reminder that in that sense, memories of colonialism, apartheid, and the third world aren't totally over. It is still a blow. And it's a blow from the global South. Yes. And in that sense, it is amazing that it came from South Africa, which has its own sort of, devastating history of colonialism and apartheid, and that South Africa was principled and courageous to remember and to act on that memory. Of course, it's a shame that India did it. But, I was in India recently, and from what I understand, the majority of the sentiment is actually with Palestine. It is only the very hard right, very, very hard right, Hindutva, the core that is pro-Israeli. Because I think even in India, there are some vestiges of colonialism, memories of colonialism. So my understanding is that the majority is still, the sentiment is really with Palestine.
I would imagine, yes.
But you're right, that the state itself, was playing its own careful game of, straddling a middle line, and did not have that kind of courage, did not have that kind of clarity that we saw South Africa, show to the world. But I'm glad. I'm not a nationalist, so I'm a vestigial third worldist. So I don't care. It doesn't have to be my nation that is the principled one. I am proud that it was South Africa.
Yes, I am too. So as I'm talking to you, I'm wondering, could it be that we're seeing a shift and a re-emergence or a gravitational shift, that South Africa and its stance might be reorganizing us to look elsewhere for how we align ourselves as the peoples of the world?
Yeah, but I mean, the idea of the third world was, the idea of the third world, the idea, which was very much something that, at the beginning of the Bandung conference, there was always very clear that there has to be a kind of Afro-Asian solidarity, that there has to be a solidarity between formerly colonized people. So that was always the case. I mean, that was true of even Nehru in India. Nehru in India was always very much, against, Nehru. I'm very critical of Nehru in terms of his internal policies in India, but I think in terms of non-alignment, in terms of third worldism, in terms of larger foreign policy, I think Nehru was Nehru in India was quite just in its and that was its own experience of colonialism that allowed it to be to identify with the South Africa against the apartheid regime, to identify with Palestine against the Zionist regime. And, it was that shared experience of suffering and shared aspiration of justice. So that was always there. And I think what is happening now is more complicated in the sense that, South Africa, it is a blow. We've seen other countries come out of it. I think come out in favor or protesting the whole genocide in Gaza. But it's still a struggle, as we know that the genocide in Gaza is going on. We are sitting in New York, and the whole establishment here, the state, the media, education. I teach at a university. they are all either quiet or completely pro-Israeli. They
Oh, yes.
refuse to see Palestinians as human beings. So, you know,
So we
it's
saw the articles this week by Friedman.
yeah, I saw the headlines. I can't read those kind.
No.
I filter out a lot of news from sake of my mental health.
Right.
But yeah, I saw but you know, there was nothing surprising.
No.
I mean, these people like Friedman, they're clowns. They're just very highly paid clowns of a very powerful empire, the most powerful empire possibly in the history of the world. And their foolishness, their idiocy basically has a huge following. But yeah, it's not surprising to see that they think it is in any way
okay
to compare to have what is it, animal kingdom?
Yes,
yeah,
the
but
jungle and the
yeah,
animal
so
kingdom.
this we are back in the old days of colonialism. We are back
Yes.
to this whole ideas of racial hierarchy.
Yes.
And the Palestinians are at the brunt. But you know, I just wanted to say that my novel, the new novel, a lot of it's also a little bit of the mourning about the third world. That is also
Yes.
part of the sensibility that Bibi
Very much
struggles
so.
with, because she is a kind of an idol. She is somebody who wants justice in the world. She does want equality in the world, and she feels she has failed and the world has failed. And even the novel's opening in the few pages. And you know, I have to say this, like, you know, when you're writing these novels, when you're writing these things, you know, I know that when I'm writing, putting the third world in Bandung, which does appear on the opening pages, Palestine appears, I think, on page 90 or so. Palestine is there. You do feel like when you're writing it that, oh, okay, no mainstream American publisher is going to publish this, because, you know, they won't say it's because of politics. They'll just say, oh, this is all, who understands what Bandung is? Who understands what the third world is? Who understands what Palestine is? It's a kind of indifference, right? And that's the indifference on which, say, the Thomas Friedmans of the world can write and add to, you know, that kind of hostile indifference. But yeah, I mean, to bring it back to the question of fiction, I mean, the latest novel is partly, it's mourning. There's Bibi is mourning the demise of India, the demise of the third world, and the demise of the world in some sense.
Yes.
And trying to see if there's a way out of this for her.
So can I make a confession here? In reading your novel, I felt I couldn't shake myself from the idea. When I visualized Bibi, I couldn't shake her away from Arundhati Roy. I kept visualizing her as Arundhati Roy, and I had to keep on saying, no, Maniza, back off.
I don't know what Roy would say to that. I mean, every reader is free to imagine characters and to read the book in their own way. I mean, to me, no, because Bibi is quite tall, and the novel says that she in fact has a little bit of a stoop because she's quite tall for a South Asian woman.
I read
idealism. Well, she's younger, courage. But she's younger though. Bibi's younger than me. She's a younger generation. Bibi is a millennial, as one of my editors pointed out.
I wasn't making you a journalist in this novel.
Bibi is a millennial, which none of us are.
Yes, so true.
Millennials are strange creatures. Bibi is a millennial. There was this whole, somebody reviewing her in America called her a Gen Xer or something like that. And my friend Carl Bromley, who read the novel in its entirety first, he objected vehemently. He said, Bibi is a millennial. If you calculate the dates, you can see that. And I agree with that. Bibi is a millennial.
Really? Would you categorize her that way or put her into that kind of a pigeonhole? I mean, there was a Bibi in every. There have been Bibis in every era, have they not?
That's true. That's true.
So I wouldn't somehow attribute anything unusual.
That's true.
We've come this far in the world and kept it together.
But that's also, it's a little bit of a good idea.
Okay, all right.
You as a reader, you are totally welcome to. I mean, every reader creates their own version of it, as you know very well as a writer. Every reader creates, because when you're reading a book, you're writing it all over again in some sense.
Yes, I definitely feel that too. So you're a journalist as well, Sid.
Yes.
Do you find that your journalism informs your novels, or do your novels inform your journalism, or it is your eye itself that sees the kind of journalism it does?
Yeah, I do get asked this a lot, and I think it's a very good question because it's true that I work with both. I do both journalism and I write fiction. And the journalism that I do, the narrative nonfiction that I do, is in some sense very different from the fiction because, fiction, you sit in your room and you write and you imagine and you read. And the journalism actually involves, I don't do opinion pieces. I actually do reporting. I actually go out, I do long form feature pieces. And it takes me to places, to people that I normally would not be able to associate with in my everyday life. It takes me very far away and to places that are not always pleasant, but where I can, discover things new. So it's true that journalism is very important to me. It's a little bit like being a detective tonight. You go out there and you are asking questions, you are seeing things. So, they do inform each other. Journalism for me, there is, when I'm writing the journalism, when I'm writing nonfiction, it's very fact bound. I don't make up things in my nonfiction. Even though I have a lawsuit going on in India against the last nonfiction book, it's been over 10 years, but it's still going on. There are 3 lawsuits, I believe, going on against the first chapter of the nonfiction book. But I tend to research and report very carefully. I write down when I quote somebody, I quote only what that person actually said. I don't make up things. Fiction is very different. Fiction is like you go to the places with fiction. You might start where the journalism, fiction starts where the journalism ends. So fiction in this novel, the new novel, which goes The Light at the End of the World, which goes into conspiracy theories, which goes into sort of, rumors, it goes into urban legends, it goes into speculative realms, it goes into psychoanalysis. These are not places that I can go into in my nonfiction, which is much based on fact and based on reporting and based on accuracy. Even the language that I use is quite different. Mm-hmm. With my nonfiction, my writing, my language tends to be very, very, there's still an interest in aesthetics. There's still interest in shape and the beauty of the sentence. But it is also meant to be clear. I don't want to be obscure to the reader. Whereas with a novel, I am much more interested in questions of form, questions of language. I am interested in more philosophical questions, more aesthetic questions. So, yes, I think some people read my fiction as being informed entirely by my journalism, but I don't think that's true. I don't think, my fiction may feature it, but I don't think I write like a reporter's novel. Maybe the second novel wasn't like it's certainly with the new novel, it is so much more playful. It is interested in history, it is interested in psychoanalysis, it is interested in conspiracies, it is interested in myth, it is interested in museums. That comes from places other than journalism. Mm-hmm. It's very interested in the form of the novel and what the novel can do.
Yes. And well, I have to say that your nonfiction, The Beautiful and the Damned, definitely informed me or armed me, I should say. I was informed about this particular situation, but it armed me on the issue of the so-called loans to the poor and on microfinance. Yes. And just exposing already hugely, vulnerable people to a risk, increasing their risk and their indebtedness to the point of suicide. And the same, recipe was being pushed around all over the world. And I happen to be working in a very, very vulnerable and fragile environment in a country where this was being suggested as the silver bullet. And I just pulled out your book and I said, if you don't want to look at other facts and reports are too much for you, here's a book, read this,
Right.
and read this chapter.
Thank you.
And really, I stopped it from happening,
Right.
basically.
Good.
Yes.
Good. Yeah, I mean, powerful empires, corporations, people love quick fixes. They love to think that you can just go in with this little tool and solve the problems of, and I'm sorry, there's this whole white savior complex. So they particularly fixate on women, women from the third world, but they don't call it the third world, but women from Africa, women from Latin America, women from Asia. And it is like the white saviors, and sometimes the elites of the third world also play a part of that, cooperate with they believe in the same things. There is this whole idea that we have these quick fixes that we come up with sitting in New York, and then we are going to take it to the northeast of India or to Andhra Pradesh, and we'll fix the problem of the farmers.
Well,
whereas
Washington, D.C.
Yeah, whereas the problem is the other way around. It's because of your really terrible policies, like for instance, like the Green Revolution, that there is this kind of crisis of arsenic poisoning, of overused groundwater, of monocultures and crops because of the GM crops that you insisted on, the kind of loans that the IMF, the World Bank, McKinsey insisted on. That is why it's not that farmers aren't stupid.
No.
These people, none of us are stupid. We are all capable of finding answers. But there is this whole fantasy of the quick fix because it makes careers, it sounds good, it sounds really nice in annual reports. I think I'm thinking of the Ivan Illich, who was this great sort of, thinker about the third world. And he has that wonderful speech that he gave in Mexico to, I think, Peace Corps people from the US, and it's called "To Hell with Your Good Intentions."
Mhm.
And I think that that's a great line to keep in mind. This is all about the good intentions of feeling good back here in DC or in New York or in London or in Delhi. It's really about what could actually make the lives of people better wherever they live.
Or taking one idea, which is a bad idea to begin with, not examining it, and then just snowballing it and making it larger and larger around the world because we're in search of success and heroes.
And we don't really want to solve the actual
We don't want to
because
solve
that involves a kind of real grappling with who we are, where we ended up, how we get here.
How did we get here?
Yeah. So, like in India, it involves a real grappling with questions of caste, with majoritarianism, the relationships between people of mainland and periphery, how people are exploited, relationship between men and women, how women are exploited, how children are exploited. These are really hard questions, right? So we don't want to talk about those. And so we just want these little band-aids that we keep moving around, as and climate change. Now, what is the relationship between us and nature? What is the relationship between water, our relationship with water? These are really difficult questions. And so, you people don't want to ask those. So
instead just throw money at it.
You want to throw money at select parts of it
so
that you can feel good about it, you can look good about it, and careers can be made.
Yeah. So, Sid, what are you working on now? Now that this huge, tremendously intense novel, which is, which is changing the shape of a traditional novel completely. Now that this is done and it's being reviewed, and it's being reviewed incredibly favorably by most people who think you've done, including myself, who think you've done a remarkable, work here. What are you working on?
Well, I have a nonfiction book coming out in April, which is a collection of my journalism since The Beautiful and the Damned. So it's a collection of my journalism from the approximately last 10, 12 years. Because The Beautiful and the Damned, the nonfiction book, came out 12 years ago, 13 years ago. So the new book is a collection of my journalism, and it is about the Hindu right in India and it's called Twilight Prisoners: The Rise of the Hindu Right and the Fall of India. So it is bound to make me even more popular with the establishment.
Oh my goodness.
That comes out in April. And
How
so
do you travel to India, and how are you safe in this current environment, may I ask?
let us,
Let it
so
go.
far, so good.
So far, so good.
Yeah. I think, I have never, I have not been able to stay quiet ever in relation to injustice. I am not somebody who discovered just 5 years ago that the BJP or the RSS or Modi is bad. I've written about this from the very beginning.
From the very beginning, and there is no
first
gap between your thoughts and your words. You don't censor yourself and say this will make me unpopular, so I won't write it.
No, I don't want popularity at that kind of price, at the price of my soul. So the nonfiction book is coming out, and I will be a little bit busy with that. And the novel is still, it's still keeping me busy with travel and festivals, which I generally like. But yeah, and then I am thinking about a new project in terms of fiction. And I'm thinking a little bit about a new project in terms of nonfiction, because I like to do both. But those are at their very early stages, right?
Will the new novel that you're thinking about be based in India, or is it going to travel somewhere else?
No, it won't be based in India very much.
Will it be based in New York?
Maybe New Jersey.
New Jersey, all right.
Yeah, maybe New York and New Jersey and elsewhere. Yeah, I'm still finding it's very early days. I'm still finding I'm letting the characters guide me.
Wonderful. I can't wait to read that. Thank you, Sid, for taking the time out and talking with me and having this conversation and bearing up with the background noise.
It's just like home.
It's just like
we're used to background noise, and it's New York. There's always background.
There's always background. Yes.
Thank you, Maniza. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.